November 3, 1944. Metz, France. Dawn lay like a pale bruise over the town. Fog pooled in gutters, and the ruins held their breath. Corporal Michael Donovan crouched in the collapsed front of a bakery, his elbows braced on cold mortar, the wood of his M1903 Springfield sticky with the morning's damp. Pieces of glass and flour dust glittered under a thin, sour light. He watched a narrow street that had once carried carts and children, now a ribbon of shadow where men vanished as if swallowed whole. If this story pulls you in, please stay until the end. Like, subscribe, and share to help keep forgotten histories alive. The pattern had teeth. For 3 weeks, the company moved in shallow columns through Metz's shattered suburbs, and the Germans had a way of extracting a price. Snipers were not novels or headlines here. They were a recurring arithmetic. Men who peered through a scope, who focused on a single bead or iron sight, found the world reduced to a tunnel, and the tunnel found them back. The losses came in a rhythm, a flash of movement at the edge of vision, a final, precise report, a man falling as if someone had cut a string. James Bradley had been the first. Donovan remembered with an unwilling clarity, a farm boy with hay-smelling hands who had laughed at bad jokes. Bradley had been 24, a private with a slow drawl and a steady rifle. He had stepped into a courtyard that morning and been killed instantly. There was no time for a scramble, no chance to return fire. Robert Chen had been older by a few years, from San Francisco, meticulous with his gear. He had been hit in the throat later that month, bled, and stayed alive long enough for the company to carry him, which felt in its own way crueler than instantaneous death. Donovan had seen both ends of that cruelty, the hollow silence after Bradley, the way the stretcher-bearers' faces tightened with Chen. Donovan was 26, a corporal who had been in the 8th Infantry since the hedgerow fighting. He had a practical way of looking at problems, not as abstractions but as interfaces that could be pushed against and altered. He had grown up repairing tractors in a county where the winter was a lesson in making do. The war had given him different metals and different noises, but the same habits. Take something apart, find the worn tooth, see how to fit a new part. In quiet hours, when mortar blasts had retired to the other edge of consciousness, he could be found on his back beneath a tarp, spitting a cigarette and sharpening a tool on the heel of a boot. He did not like being seen as a tinkerer for show. His fiddling was always practical, a way to keep his men breathing. The tactical problem that had lodged in Donovan's head was almost humiliating in its simplicity. The Springfield's scoop allowed a man to find a point at distance with terrible precision, but that lens was also a funnel. When a shooter had his eye pressed to glass, his field of vision shrank to what that tube framed. The battlefield, never neat, worked around that tunnel. German snipers hunted the edges, stalking where a scope could not look at once. Flanks, hedgerows, broken windows at shallow angles. Men were being skimmed away not by bad aim, but by a geometry of seeing. Command called it accidental exposure. Men called it murder. It was Sergeant Frank Wilson who first spoke the word that made Donovan's fingers go still. Wilson had been a hunter back home, lean and sunburned, with a straightforward contempt for anything that wasted a life. "Something gives us eyes on the sides," Wilson had said, voice low enough that the artillery beyond town couldn't pick it up. Give the scope a second view. They tried simple fixes at first, different guard patterns, extra pairs on point. Those helped sometimes, but snipers adapted. It was in the stretch of empty nights, with the town silent and Donovan awake to the soft scrape of surviving mortar, that a small, ridiculous thought took shape. He had been polishing a piece of broken porcelain for a mate's lighter when he noticed his face in the shard, not full, but offset, reversed. The world could reach around a corner if one allowed reflection to do the work. The idea was not elegant, a peripheral reflection to give a shooter a hint of movement outside the scope's tunnel. It would not make a man omniscient, but it could rebalance the geometry of sight. Donovan did not announce it at first. He worked in a tent with scrap and an attitude that tolerated risk. A pocket mirror salvaged from the remains of a field hospital, wire twists, the fragment of an old bayonet sheath. He kept measurements shallow in his head. He was careful not to draw up anything that could be mistaken for an engineering manual. What he wanted was a proof of concept, something that could be strapped, held, or steadied without complicated tools. He tested angles with a small glass, catching the periphery of a lane and then putting the glass aside when the patrols came through. His movements were quiet. Imagination in those days could be as dangerous as any piece of ordnance. The company had become conditional in routine. Watch, move, watch again. Donovan's 3 close comrades were the measure by which he understood risk. Bradley's death had been a stone dropped into a pool, the concentric circles of grief omnipresent. Chen's slow going had been a test of endurance for the unit's morale. Men watched the doctor work and then watched him fail. Those deaths layered on top of each other in the kind of accumulation that hardened into a decision. When Sam Martinez, 19 and still thin with farm leanings, moved to Donovan's side, it was with the open curiosity of someone who had seen his first dead man and refused to be paralyzed by it. "Show me," Martinez said the night Donovan finished the crude rig. They sat in a dugout warmed by a tin can and a small flame. The mirror sat on a scrap of wood, a tiny plane of silver as unassuming as a coin. Donovan pointed to a patch of dirt and then to the glass. "It'll tell you if someone slips into the lane you've not already got through the scope," he muttered, keeping his voice low. "Not to aim at it, just to see motion. That's what we lose most, the motion at the seam." Martinez had the steady hands of a kid who had handled animals. He took the instrument and held it as if it were a bird. "Looks dumb," he said, but his smile was the way of men who trust what works more than what looks good. Donovan shrugged. "If it saves your hide, it's not dumb." They had no authority to modify issued equipment. Regulations in wartime were thick with good intentions and thin with the particularities of a ruined town. Captain Robert Hayes, the company commander, was the kind of officer who saw benefit in a good idea and danger in disorder. He had a reputation for protecting his men within the boundaries of discipline. When Donovan brought the idea to Hayes, he did it with the same economy he used with a rifle: clinical, practical. "Minor field adaptation," Donovan said. "No structural change, just a way to notice lateral movement." Hayes did not immediately bless the experiment. He folded his hands, considered the man, then considered the problem. He was a career officer with a punctuation of caution, but he had lost men too. "You run a test," Hayes said finally. "If it helps and you don't make a spectacle, we'll see about wider use." There was an implied warning in the tone: make this work and keep it simple. The first field trials were small affairs, informal and dangerous in their modesty. The men went out at dawn, when the fog sat low and the town felt hollowed. Donovan positioned Martinez at a window with a view of a cross street and asked him to watch the mirror while keeping the scope at the ready. Around them the town breathed. A cart creaked in the far distance, a dog barked twice and then silenced itself. The mirror offered a tiny slice of the outside world, a sliver of movement that might have been otherwise clipped by the scope's framing. For an hour nothing happened, and the test might have been dismissed as superstition, just another tinker's tale, if not for the small scrape at the edge of sight. A shadow moved, not in the scope, but in the mirror's angle, a flicker at the periphery like a thought. Martinez's hand tapped Donovan's shoulder. "Over there," he whispered. Donovan jerked his eyes from glass to glass. In a beat they saw it, a gun muzzle sliding past a shattered shutter to the left flank. The man was not hidden so much as positioned to take advantage of a shooter's immobility. Donovan's hand was already on his rifle before the report. The target was not as trained as the concept, and the engagement resolved in a flurry rather than a report that spelled names. The man went down, and for the first time in too long the company felt a small, livable victory. It was not only the saving of one life that mattered in that drop of success. It was the proof that the battlefield's geometry could be nudged. The mirror introduced an element of unpredictability to the predator's calculation. Where a sniper counted on a tunnel of vision, the mirror offered a sliver of contradiction. News circulated in the way small, useful things do among men in a war. Quietly, without formal memorandum, by way of shared smoke and a nod in the mess. The device passed from hand to hand, adapted slightly here and there by whoever took a minute to file a corner or fashion a strap. Not everyone applauded. Field improvisation often found enemies in the letter of regulations. There were moments when an inspection threatened to unmake what had been made useful. An ordnance detachment from Aberdeen Proving Ground was due for review. A routine evaluation by men whose business was ordering the chaos of field work into forms Washington could read. Donovan had expected skepticism. What he had not expected was the way the evaluation would proceed. A careful, clinical assessment that recognized function even as it noted informality. The officers and technicians did not live on the same soil as the men in Metz. They had maps and charts and an inclination to generalize. They recorded angles and suggested tests, and they recommended what they called formal evaluation to see if the idea warranted broader trials. There would be paperwork, then central authorities, then the slow churn of military endorsement. The company benefited in the months that followed. Reports from adjacent units showed a drop in lateral ambushes where the adaptation circulated. A few lives had been spared, the numbers small but real. A handful of men returned from patrols who might otherwise have been names on a ledger. The mirror had become a motif, a scratched circle of silver under bandages, a small rescue in a town that otherwise catalogued ruin. But the mirror also carried an erasure. Bureaucracy consumes particularities in the act of making a thing official. When the technical report moved through channels toward recommendation, the voice that accompanied it bore the flattened shape of institutional language. A test team might suggest the integration of a peripheral reflector, a device to widen a shooter's situational awareness. The paper spoke of prototypes and trials, not of the man in a bakery tent who had first set the glass at a certain angle. Donovan's name did not move with the recommendation. Equations and charts displace individuals. It was the old arithmetic of war. The field's improvisation was valuable, and once it flowed into doctrine, its origin often leaked away. Donovan understood the calculus of that erasure with the weary calm of someone who had seen enough of military machinery's appetite for anonymity. He never sought medals. He did not want to be a footnote press-clipped into a future citation. But he wanted, in the small way he could allow himself, for the men who had died to be counted in the ledger in a way that wasn't sterile. He thought of Bradley when he polished the mirror's edge, of Chen when he checked the strap, of Martinez when he saw the way the younger man caught at a shadow and alerted the line. Late one November evening, before the town fell into that particular kind of war-weather quiet, Donovan sat with Martinez and Wilson and told them what he would do if the war let him live beyond its edges. He spoke not of medals, but of a small farm where he could fix tractors again, of a sister who wrote letters and smelled faintly of lavender, of simple things. They listened because telling the future was a salve against the present. Word reached the unit that an ordnance team from Aberdeen would be sent to the front lines to observe the device in action. For Donovan, the arrival of formal observers meant commotion and risk. A testing team might insist on controlled procedures, on sterilized conditions that would strip the device of the improvisational logic that made it work. Captain Hayes briefed the men in a low room that smelled like boiled coffee and old sweat. "Don't make it a circus," he said. "Show them how it works. Keep it practical." Donovan nodded. He kept his face still, but his hands trembled the way muscles do when they carry the memory of too many sudden impacts. On the morning the evaluation team came, frost rimed the rubble, and breath hung white from mouths. The evaluators wore the precise air of men whose days were measured in test tables, not in men who had once seen brothers fall. They set clipboards in the street and brought diagrams. Donovan watched them from a distance, an invisible seam between two worlds, the one that worked in the dirt and the other that arranged benefit into forms. He presented the device as he always had, simply, without flourish. He explained the principle in the clipped language that soldiers and technicians both understood: increased situational awareness at the periphery of a shooter's field. He refused to offer blueprints. It's not about how to build it, he told them, it's about what it changes. One of the technicians, a woman whose hands moved with the trained certainty of someone who had handled fragile instruments, peered through the mirror and then through the scope. She did not smile, but she made a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It narrows the catchment for lateral movement," she said into a notebook. The phrase was dry, but the meaning translated into a human shape: fewer men in the ground. The evaluators agreed to take a prototype back for controlled trials. Their reports would later feed into a recommendation for wider testing at proving grounds farther from the front. Yet, as often happened with field-borne inventions, the language of the report ossified the device into generic terminology: peripheral reflector. Names evaporated in the act of systematizing. Donovan's involvement entered no official citation. The men who had used his device carried it forward. Martinez taught a replacement how to set the glass. Wilson adjusted a strap for a taller man. Hayes, who had watched the small intervention save lives, kept his silence when asked who had proposed the idea. For a while, the story of the mirror lived as a shared anecdote among veterans of that narrow front. In the pubs after the war, the device might be mentioned between sips and cigarette smoke, its origin attributed to some corporal. For Donovan, the war ended, and then it did not. He came home to a country that called its heroes broadly and often, with an attention that blurred specifics. He fixed tractors and married a woman whose name he had kept in a pocket of his memory. He did not seek recognition. He refused invitations to speak in grand halls. The only real continuity between the war and the field was a small box, wrapped in oilcloth, in which Donovan had kept one mirror. Decades later, a historian would find that box in an attic where it had been stored among ration tins and a rusting spade. The historian pieced together records and interviews, tracking the device's diffusion through after-action reports and oral testimony. He traced the arc from a bakery's collapsed front to the notebooks of ordnance technicians, and then to an archived letter from Captain Hayes. In a paper read at a small conference, the historian named Michael Donovan as the improviser whose quiet work nudged doctrine towards safer practice. It was the kind of recognition that came late and softly, a belated correction to the ledger. But there was more to be told before the ledger could be righted. The first time the adaptation had faced a large-scale ambush, when a German sniper team attempted to take a whole squad in a coordinated flank, it had been a test of everything the men had been skirting toward. Donovan had gone with them that day, not because he wanted a headline, but because the calculus of witness demanded it. They moved down a lane choked with rubble. The fog lay heavy, and the air tasted like iron. Martinez had the mirror set, and his breath came even. A young man's calm hardened into a soldier's focus. Wilson flanked them, eyes sharp as carved stone. Hayes watched from a higher window, his silhouette a dark punctuation in the ruined roofline. There was a sound from the left, a whisper of movement that from some angles might have meant nothing at all. Martinez felt it through the mirror before the scope could catch it, a smear at the periphery that shifted with the wind. He tapped Donovan, then lowered his eye to the scope with the practiced speed of a man who had learned that hesitation could be fatal. What followed was not elegiac, but sharp. A sequence of shots, rapid repositioning, the kind of chaotic clarity that belongs to firefights. Donovan did not keep his hands clean of the fight. He moved, aimed, and filled the space that the mirror had given him with something decisive. The day after, the report would note a reduction in flank casualties for the patrol. Men who might have been lost were not. The mirror had not turned the tide of the war, nor did it pretend to. It had been a small intervention that altered a pattern. For Donovan, the victory felt like a patch on a frayed coat, helpful, necessary, but not erasing the holes that remained. In the quiet that followed the action, as men checked gear and silently recounted the luck that had kept them alive, Donovan sat alone and looked at the tiny circle of glass. In it, he saw not only the town's reflection, but the faces of the men who would not come home. The device traveled onward, sometimes under a different name in the files, sometimes as an anonymous marginal note in a Proving Grounds report. The institution eventually absorbed the idea, because institutions absorb what works. It rewrote a small part of doctrine in the teeth of necessity. But the human constellations that had birthed the mirror were scattered. Bradley and Chen did not live to read the reports. Martinez lived and kept the story in his throat for the rest of his days. Wilson carried the habit of watching the periphery into peacetime hunts. And Captain Hayes kept a private copy of one old, grainy photograph that showed men at a window, faces tense, rifles ready. When the historian finally published his article, and later a short monograph, Donovan's name appeared in the body of footnotes. For some veterans it was enough. For Donovan, who had never sought renown, it was a kind of tidy restitution, a public echo of what had been private and messy. A small mirror, its silver dimmed by age and oil, eventually found its way into a museum display, captioned in the institutional language that had first swallowed his name. The plaque spoke of field adaptation and improved situational awareness, and included dates and unit numbers. Nearby, preserved uniforms breathed under glass. Visitors paused, read the label, and some left more than they had arrived with, a sense that small, unlikely acts could shift the arithmetic of harm. Donovan died with the ease of a man whose life had been lived in work rather than accolades. His obituary mentioned his service and the town where he had returned. In correspondence that surfaced after his death, a letter from Captain Hayes to a friend of Donovan's made explicit what the public record had not. Hayes acknowledged that it had been Donovan's stubbornness that had saved lives, and that, in the cramped ledger of formal awards, there had been neither space nor appetite to mark him properly. The historian's later recovery could not restore a name to every grave, but it had done a kind of moral arithmetic. To remember was to correct, however slightly, an institutional amnesia. The mirror remained the story's compact symbol, a small, unadorned object that bridged practical need and human cost. It was neither heroic in the sweep of epics nor trivial in consequence. Donovan's work showed how improvisation in war could act as a narrow instrument of mercy, not to sanctify fighting, but to reduce the toll it took on men who wanted to live, to fix tractors and marry and hold their children. The town of Metz would rebuild, and the fog would lift with seasons. But the geometry Donovan had altered, the way a man could, by seeing more of the world at once, avoid the seam that took him, remained a quiet testament. There was one final small detail that kept Donovan's memory from being purely archival. Each year, on the anniversary of the company's first successful test, a handful of veterans sent a wreath to the small museum where the mirror rested. They left no proclamations, only a few wildflowers and a folded note sometimes, scrawled with a name or a memory. For those who knew, the mirror was not merely a device, but a ledger of friendship and loss and the stubborn refusal to accept the arithmetic that said some men had to be expendable. The story of the mirror, of Michael Donovan and the men who lived and died around his idea, did something simple and, in its modesty, profound. It made visible the way the smallest inventions can steer fate in a tight corner. It reminded later readers that innovation in war was not solely a product of laboratories and generals, but often of men crouched in ruined bakeries, polishing glass, and refusing to accept that tunnel vision was destiny. On a morning years after the war, in a town that had rebuilt around economies other than the machinery of fighting, an old Sam Martinez stood beneath the same window that had once framed a lane of danger. He touched the museum case with careful fingers and remembered the angle of the glass, the cold of the mortar, and the faces of those who had taught him to watch the periphery. He told a young volunteer, in a voice that had been softened by time, that the trick had always been absurdly simple. To see what you were not supposed to see, to give a man a sliver of the world his scope denied him. The volunteer listened as if she had heard it before and had not. The device itself was small and plain, but its moral weight rested on the human lives it had quietly protected, and on the stubbornness of a corporal who would rather risk a reprimand than send another friend to the ground. In museums and footnotes, and in the thin, patient work of historians, that stubbornness found a late companion, acknowledgment. It was not triumphal, it was instead a corrective, a small settling of accounts. There remained one engagement that would come to define the mirror's tactical reputation in the narrow literature that followed. A larger ambush where the reflector's peripheral cue turned the balance and allowed a squad to survive a flanking maneuver that might otherwise have been their end. It was the kind of fight that would test the idea under full pressure, with the enemy coordinated and determined. Donovan and his men prepared for it in the same way soldiers always prepared, by inventorying what they had, by checking straps and breath, by sharing a look that meant both fear and a fierce practical hope. They moved into the lane with fog like a memory and a lean quiescence. Donovan felt the weight of 100 small decisions press on him, the ones that added up to something like responsibility. Martinez set the mirror and held it there, fingers steady. Wilson leaned to the left, eyes like a scout's. Hayes watched from above. The town held its breath. In that charged, silent instant before the first report, the world narrowed to a handful of sensory truths: the scrape of gravel under a boot, the metallic taste of cold air, the faint reflection of movement caught in a small pane of glass. The ambush, when it came, would decide more than a single patrol's fate. It would say whether improvisation could stand against organized violence, whether a small, absurd trick could hold in the teeth of terror. They stepped forward into that decision together. A crack split the fog, a sound close, metallic, a breath of wood on stone. And then the world exploded into motion. Rifles barked like sudden gulls. Men shoved their weight sideways, feet sliding on wet cobbles. Smoke uncurled from muzzles and hung, gray and slow, between buildings. For a heartbeat, the lane was nothing but noise. Then a small pane of glass caught movement where no one else had looked. Martinez's hand tightened on the mirror until his knuckles whitened. He had practiced this small choreography until the motion between his fingers felt like prayer. Tilt, hold, name what the glass gave him. The mirror showed a shadow slipping abreast some ruin 2 houses down. A thigh, a sling of gear, the white flash of a helmet. It was a seam in the enemy's formation, a place where training had not yet sewn men together. Donovan saw it as clearly as if a map had unfolded beneath his boots. "Left!" he shouted, and the command was not so much tactical as urgent, a man ordering the world to answer. Wilson pivoted, moving like a shadow himself, and Hayes let off a careful burst from above that clipped the shutter an enemy had leaned against. The flank stepped into the light of 4 rifles aimed at the seam. Confusion leached through the enemy line, as if through a wound. The firefight narrowed into small, savage decisions. One of the attackers, young, rankless, hesitated beneath an arch and was hauled down by a shot that sent him stumbling back into the fog. Another tried to circle behind a cart and found Hayes already waiting there, rifle steady. They fought in fragments. 2 men here, a single rifle there. Donovan heard the ragged breath of his squad, the count of rounds, the faint, obscene rasp of a man trying to scream while the world pushed air back into him. They did not win cleanly. War never offered such favors. A boy from the unit took a round in the calf. Wilson's jacket was smeared with mud and something darker. There were close things, a hand that missed another by inches, a boot that slid from a lip of stone and found no purchase. But the seam the mirror had revealed never closed in on them. The enemy, deprived of surprise and forced into a shrinking geometry, broke. They stumbled back into the fog, toward trenches and places where war kept its heavy machines. The lane, which had expected to be a corridor of slaughter, was instead a small theater of stubborn survival. After the smoke, there was the usual arithmetic. Who had taken what wound? Who could still walk? Which guns could be salvaged? Martinez lowered the mirror and set it on a crate as if it were a holy thing that had been returned to the earth. Men crouched and breathed and cursed softly, and laughed once, briefly, as if laughter could stitch up the hollows inside them. Donovan walked the lane and touched a wall where a bullet had chewed brick. His fingers came away dusty and red. He did not speak much. The decision had been made by a small pane of glass and by a habit of noticing. The moral consequence, that one might choose to see more rather than obey the narrowness of orders, sat on him like a coat. Word of the engagement threaded its way back through the town and into the channels that mattered. Reports called it an odd victory, an ambush anticipated and foiled by a device of no consequence. Some officers laughed it off as an anecdote, the kind of story that made for late-night boasting. Others inspected the crude reflector and the accounts of men who had not been cut down and began, quietly, to ask questions about how what was seen could alter what was possible. Donovan watched those questions with the wary optimism of a man who knew plans could be turned into policies and policies into forgetfulness. He had never wanted the mirror to be a doctrine. It was a tactic, an insistence that attention could be broadened. But attention, when it proved itself able to preserve flesh and bone, drew committees and generals and men who preferred formulas. In the months that followed, small experiments proliferated. Mirrors painted on helmets, slivers of polished metal lashed to bayonets, reflective patches sewn into coats. Some of these contrivances were nonsense, some were ingenious. There were lectures and late arguments about chance and determinism. Some commanders embraced the idea cautiously, as if adopting it might somehow invite chaos. Others forbade it outright, wary of artifice that seemed to circumvent the sacred binary of order and obedience. Through it all, the men who had stood in that lane kept their ledger in the quiet way soldiers keep anything sacred, with small rites that required no permission. The mirror went back into Martinez's pack more times than anyone could count. Once, on a patrol near a different village, it saved 3 men who would otherwise have walked into a crossfire. Once, in a place where the fog was thicker than a thought, its reflection missed the seam and a man died for it. Those losses hung heavy. They were a reminder that no trick could make war just. Years later, when the mirror lived under glass and little boys pressed their noses to the case, Donovan would still feel the lane in his chest. He did not think himself a hero. He thought he had done one small, stubborn thing, argued by gesture and by risk that the circle of a man's sight need not be fixed. In the ledger of the living and the dead, that argument had cost and had saved. It also, quietly, changed what men considered possible. Outside the museum, Metz kept rebuilding its streets and businesses and the peculiar dignity of people who will their children to live. Inside, the mirror rested like a memory that refused to be sentimentalized. Visitors read the sparse labels and imagined less than the men who had been there. The veterans who left wreaths did not always talk about tactics. They left names, sometimes a date, often a single line, foreseeing the other side of the street. In that line there was both gratitude and a confession, that they had been saved by something human and slight, by a choice to look where looking was forbidden. Donovan's name was on one of those notes once. He never sought it. He kept it folded inside a book at home. When rain came heavy and the windows shivered, he would hold the book and think of the soft click of Martinez's fingers on the mirror, the precise moment when a small rectangle of glass stretched a man's world and tilted fate by millimeters. He knew, as all men who have held a narrow mercy know, that such things do not make war forgiven. They make it survivable. They make it human. And sometimes, in the way a wound looks less terrible when bandaged, they give a life back to a man who would later fix a tractor, marry, or hold a child, and know that he had been given that chance by a refusal to accept what seemed inevitable. He went back to the museum in a season of low light, when the town's repairs were done enough to look respectable and not finished. The glass case stood in the same dim room, the same narrow beam trained on the rectangle so that it seemed to hold its own sky. People drifted past with the economy of attention that belongs to places meant to educate rather than to wound. Some read the label, some took pictures on their phones and then scrolled at once away from what they had just seen. Donovan watched them like a man who knows too well how quickly a thing can be recognized and then rearranged into a comfortable story. The plaque had been reworded twice since the war, first by a committee who admired brevity, then by a historian who admired narrative. Now it said, in a voice as neutral as a ledger entry, that a reflective device altered the outcome of a skirmish, and named dates and regiments and honors. It listed no deaths. It used the word tactic as if that could contain blood. Donovan ran his thumb along the edge of the case and felt only the chill of polished surface and the pressure of a truth narrowed into a sentence. He had brought the folded note with him because folded paper carried a kind of authority that only paper has. It was small, the size of a receipt, with Donovan's name on the outside and inside a line he had never read aloud, "Foreseeing the other side of the street." He had kept it in the book at home for years, the way one keeps a splinter under the skin, painful if touched, better if left alone. Today he would give it back to the world, or at least leave it where the world might find it and misplace it again. A woman in the doorway watched him. She was not a tourist. She wore the fastidious gray of someone who had thought much about the town's shape. Her hands were folded in front of her like someone who had once been a nurse and still held her palms ready to steady another. She did not ask if he was a veteran. She did not ask his name. She said simply, "You came back." He told her that he always came back, as if that answered anything. She smiled the way people do when they are about to tell you something that will need telling. My name is Maria," she said. "Martinez was my grandfather." Donovan felt the room tilt for the first time that day. Martinez's name scraped at him in the way all old names do, a call and a wound. "You knew him?" he asked. She nodded. "He never returned to this lane. He kept his mirror wrapped in a sock for a long time. Gave it to my father when he could no longer carry things. Said it had fooled him twice and betrayed him once. There was a way he said it, as if the mirror had opinions." "How did he die?" Donovan asked, unable to stop. The question rose because men ask it to make memory manageable. "In the floods," she said. "He couldn't lift the boards. My father said later that Martinez spent the last of his breath shouting for neighbors instead of keeping the road for himself. People used to laugh that he had always been looking sideways. Maybe that made him quicker to bend to someone else's need." Donovan thought of the lane, of hands, of the click, and then of the ledger where men kept names and small rights. "He risked a lot for that click," he said. "He was reckless." "Maybe," Maria said. "Or maybe he only refused to believe danger came only from where you were told to look. That sounds like recklessness when men are dying, but when it saves hands. She cut the sentence off with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. My grandmother kept a little tin box with odds and ends. When she died, my father found the mirror wrapped in a scrap of cloth. He put it in a drawer and then gave it away when the family could not keep all that the war left them. We never thought it would end up behind glass. They walked the case together, reading the label, then reading it again because people read the same sentence twice when they hope the second time will add a missing word. Donovan held the folded note and thought of names he had never had courage to put on the record. He pictured Martinez's fingers finding the reflective edge in the dark, the way a man might find a prayer in his pocket. "Do you mind if I—" Maria touched the case with the respect of someone who still expected miracles to resent being handled. She told Donovan how, in the house where Martinez had lived after the war, children had pressed their faces to the little window to watch sunlight make a band of brightness cross the kitchen table. He would sit and angle his teacup just to catch the light, she said. He called it practice. Her voice softened, said you had to keep practicing how to see better. The curator appeared then, a thin man with a clean collar and the perpetual mildness of someone who must always be at odds between history and visitors. He introduced himself as Avery and spoke a little about donations and preservation. He seemed pleased that Donovan had come, as if visitors of that kind were the museum's validation. He asked, politely, if Donovan would be willing to sign the guest book. Donovan nodded. He had never thought of his attendance as a formality, but he found his hand steady when the pen was passed. When he closed the book, he felt suddenly foolish, as if the signature could obviate the ledger of memory he had always kept inside him. He reached into his pocket, took out the folded note, and for a long moment did nothing. The lobby hummed with the quiet voices of cataloging and of strangers who thought the world's machinery could contain grief. He placed the paper between 2 pages of a volume of oral histories that lay in a glass-topped case near the visitor's bench. It was not an authorized thing to do. It was the same small disobedience that had guided a man's fingers on the mirror years before. Maria watched him, then leaned closer. In the slanted light, his folded handwriting looked exactly like the past, a cramped, practical scrawl. "What did you write?" she asked. "For seeing the other side of the street," Donovan said. The line felt both obsolete and urgent when spoken. She nodded slowly, as if accepting something that could not be changed. "That's what my grandfather taught us," she said. "Not to look for blame, but to look for ways to give someone else a chance." Her lips tightened. "You did more than argue for it. You kept it alive." They stood in the hush that people leave when they are remembering aloud to one another. Donovan wanted to tell her about the ledger, about the men who had visited his kitchen table to whisper dates into his ear when they could no longer bear to speak them where anyone else could hear. He wanted also, suddenly, to tell her about the man who had died when the reflection missed the seam, how the loss stayed with the men who had lived through it, how no small trick could absolve that pain. He kept his mouth closed and let the silence be the thing that passed between them. Outside the museum, the rain had started again. Donovan thought of the town's rebuilding, windows, facades, the civic itch to make the past tidy. He thought of committees and generals and the clever men who will perfect a method until its meaning dissolves into a brand. The mirror had already become a lesson for some and an artifact for others. He had no power to stop the latter, but he could, perhaps, nudge the telling. "Will you come tomorrow?" Maria asked him suddenly. "There's a talk scheduled. They're inviting veterans to speak about tactics and morale. Some of the younger officers want to hear about the lane." Donovan looked at her and felt, with a clarity that made his limbs ache, the thin border between telling and being turned into something else. He had no appetite for lectures, for men to explain a life into a diagram. But he also understood that the truth had to be said so often that it wearied of repetition. Otherwise the story would harden into a doctrine. "I will come," he said. He heard his own voice as if it belonged to someone else, older, steadier. "If they mean to talk, I will go and tell them what I remember. Not what saved them a medal, but what saved hands." Maria nodded, relieved and elated. "Good," she said. "They should hear it from someone who was there." That evening Donovan walked home through streets that smelled of wet stone and cooking. The town had been rebuilt in layers, new bricks laid where old foundations had been found, flowers planted over graves that were marked and then unmarked, the careful human work of trying to put life where there had been absence. He kept his folded book close to his chest like a map. The rain made the world soft at the edges. At home he made tea and sat by the window as the house settled and the night came. On the table lay the ledger he had begun years ago, names, short notations, a line here and there about who had been saved and who had not. He opened it and found Martinez's name among others, a cramped entry that read, in his hand, "Martinez, mirror, saved 3, lost 1, wouldn't stop looking." He set the tea down and pressed his palm to the page, as if one could transfer warmth through paper. Later, when the rain was harder, he took the book to his bookshelf and slid Martinez's folded note into his own copy of a collection of letters. He did not reveal its contents. Tenderness sometimes favors private custody. He had given the public to the museum and kept the personal where it could be held without need of explanation. There was a modest cruelty in how memory asks to be both shared and guarded. In the night, Donovan dreamed of the lane. The dream was not the replay of a moment, but rather the sensation of an act, the narrowing of a world, the click of a finger, the sudden tilt that reveals the other side. He woke with the echo of that small sound in his mouth, and felt, for a long time, its shape like a coin against his tongue. It was the same impulse, dangerous, tender, that had sent men to risk themselves for something that could not be legislated into virtue. Days later, the museum talk drew a crowd that included curious families, young officers in crisp jackets, a few old faces with medals dimmed by time and handling. Donovan sat near the back in a chair that creaked under him, his coat buttoned to his throat as if to pin down memories. Speakers rose and spoke in practical voices about initiative and adaptation. They used language that smelled faintly of bullet metal and thinking tanks. Force multipliers, tactical adaptation, lessons learned. Donovan counted the phrases like a man counting stitches, waiting for the moment when human consequence would be named plain. When it was his turn, he walked to the podium like a man escorting a child across a street. He did not speak of doctrine. He did not give the kind of talk that could be printed and used to justify a new reflective standard for helmets. He spoke instead of hands. "I remember faces," he said simply. "People not as instruments of strategy, but as people whose hands had plans. The trick we used, what you read about as a device, was a courtesy. It was a way to give hands a chance to move. That is not a doctrine. It's a question. When you can, will you make space for the person next to you to act?" A young officer in the front row nodded as if he understood a solution. An old sergeant folded his arms and frowned because some things that save men are too small for insignia. Donovan kept talking because once he had let his voice begin, he could not stop. At the urge to protect memory, he told them about Martinez's soft chuckle when the mirror did its work, about the day it failed and how that failure was a debt the men would always carry. He asked them, plainly, not to turn a trick into a religion, not to imagine that an innovation absolved them of the duty to look after one another. Afterwards, Maria found him by the case. "You said the right things," she told him, and Donovan felt a weight lift because there are times when being true to pain is also a kind of gift. People continued to write in the guest book. Some left notes of gratitude, a name, a date. A few wrote less and took more. Small folded papers passed to one another, ideas exchanged that would take shape in quiet ways. Donovan watched a boy press his nose against the glass and smiled because the boy's eyes had that raw hunger that had once made Martinez angle his cup toward the light. Children will press noses to glass. They always will. Some will look away, content. Some will look and decide to carry the habit forward. Months later, the museum curator sent Donovan a letter asking permission to include a quote from his talk in the next revision of the plaque. It was phrased with all the careful civility of men who balance truth and exhibition. Donovan wrote back with a short sentence. Say that it was a choice to look, not a license to stop looking after that choice. They printed the line. It sat now in the museum alongside dates and regiment numbers, a sentence small as a stitch. People read it and pressed their noses and left with a sudden, often temporary, enlarging. For Donovan, it was not enough to correct history. No single sentence ever could. But it was a beginning that refused to let the story harden into a single comfortable explanation. Years went on. The mirror remained under glass. Sometimes it cast a band of light across the case that made the whole room look as if it had been briefly admitted into mercy. Donovan, when he could, went to sit and watch the way strangers rearranged their faces to accommodate the thing. He never watched the mirror as if it were the point. He watched instead the people who read the plaque and the way their gestures betrayed the limits of what words could hold. In the end, he kept two ledgers, the public one that named dates and honors, and the private one where he wrote small truths that did not look well in plaques. He tucked the folded note into the ledger for safekeeping, and occasionally took it out to remind himself that some gestures are meant to be given and some to be returned. On the last bright morning before he felt his hands begin to move more slowly than his will, he walked to the museum and, in the light that made the mirror glow like a sliver of sky, he murmured a thanks that was not grand and not loud. It was the kind of prayer that sits better in the throat than in the air. He left a small card in the oral histories case, not a public pronouncement, but a tiny addition to the long ledger of human smallness, and walked away knowing that the click of fingers, the act of looking where one was told not to, would continue to be repeated, misread, cherished, and argued over. He had no illusion that it would change the nature of war. It would not. But in the ledger of the living and the dead, in the rows of names and the folded notes tucked into books, it would survive as something that once, briefly, enlarged a man's world enough to give him back a life. That was all a single small mercy could ask. He went home to mend a broken stool and to listen for the rain. Outside, the town polished itself and shifted the ruins into streets. Inside the museum, the mirror waits beneath its beam, patient as the past and small as a spark. And men, going about their various urgencies, will sometimes stop and look. Some will see only their own reflection. Some will remember to glance sideways. The world keeps making new committees. The world keeps making new rules. The other small things continue to be stubborn, quietly refusing to be simplified. Donovan pressed his palm against the window pane on his way into the house. In the reflection, he saw an old man, weathered and plain, holding a book against his chest. For a moment, the image was doubled by the glass across the street where a child had paused to look. And in that brief, ordinary multiplication of sights, he felt something akin to peace. He thought of Martinez, of the men who had kept ledgers, of the noises that small metal could make in the dark, and he smiled because a life could be held in such small acts. The rain began again, soft and steady, and he felt the house settle like a hand laying itself over a wound. He made tea, sat, and turned a page. The ledger lay open. Outside, the town moved forward, and the mirror under glass caught a stray strip of light and made a little sky of it. The sky did not change the rest of the world. It simply, for a moment, made seeing possible.